Kavod on the Road program. It is the Israel's battle for diplomacy, and we have a wonderful guest, Danny Seaman, who Danny has been an Israeli media professional and a formal civil servant. He's mainly been active in our fields of foreign service and public diplomacy. Danny worked with the Israeli Civil Service for 31 years between the years of 1983 and 2014. Between the years 2000 and 2010, he served as the director of the Israeli government's press office, the GPO. He was part of the Prime Minister's office in Jerusalem, responsible for the foreign media contingent in Israel. His last public position was Deputy Director General for Information at the Ministry of Public Diplomacy and Diaspora Affairs. Since 2014, Danny has worked in the English language media on Israeli current affairs, and he's here to speak with us today.
First, I want to thank you all and for the opportunity to give a little insights into what is happening here. While we were waiting, I'm checking to see if anything unusual happened today. So nothing really exceptional. Seems to be just another normal day in Israel, only this time we're not running to the shelters for any reason. I thought or I was more asked to concentrate on not the regular news, but the aspect of Israel diplomacy. And diplomacy is actually split into two elements. One is the diplomacy as we know it, the foreign affairs, the relations with other countries. And there's another aspect that we call the public diplomacy, which is also I would say these are all, we have the battlefield with Israel is engaged in on the field itself. That's in Gaza, in Lebanon, Syria, Judea and Samaria, with the Houthis and with Iraq and also with Iran, as if we don't have enough enemies. But there's also the element of both diplomacy, which is also a battlefield that Israel has to deal with at United Nations in the general concept, with the United States, which is basically or perhaps our only ally to a degree, and also with other countries. But there's also the public diplomacy aspect or the cognitive warfare, which tries to influence the way people perceive, or not only how they perceive, but to be able to combat the disinformation being spread. And as we see now, the hatred that is being spewed and has come up again after so many years, to a degree that unforeseen since perhaps the Holocaust. So, which basically fits in what we faced over the past year and 3 months. So we shouldn't be surprised about that because history doesn't change. We had a lull in that for a while. Perhaps people were, maybe they felt they exaggerated or were crossed the line with the hatred towards the Jews with World War II. And so there was a lull in that for quite a few years, and now it's all coming out again. So these are two elements that Israel has to face and combat also with that. If I start with the diplomacy itself, you can see that there are two, or well, maybe three arenas. You have the one arena, which is Israel and the United States relationship, which is the most important to the state of Israel. Despite criticisms, despite there's an element of disagreement between this administration and Israel, still the relationship is very strong, and Israel has been aided to a large degree by this administration and by the United States, basically because the United States, the American people, to a large degree, are supportive of the state of Israel, do see eye to eye with the Israelis, and understand the situation that Israel is in. And it's been the way of the governments in the United States for a very long time. Now, it's not because they're being nice or because of, like people like to say, you know, they're an ally and they're friends. There's no such thing when it comes to the world diplomacy. There's only interests. And what people tend to ignore is the fact that Israel, to a large degree, very much does provide and does serve the interests of the United States. Now, the United States is different than every other country. The United States, you can say that its basis is very similar to that as the state of Israel, which are the fundamentals of both countries are found in what they call in the West the Judeo-Christian values. And those Judeo-Christian values, which the United States is very clear about, allow us to focus on, let's put it this way, it's not just cynicism that drives the countries, but there are certain principles that, if not the governments, at least the populations of these two countries do abide by. So this allows Israel to be close to the American people and to the United States as a country. But then again, the United States is a country and it has its own interests. And had Israel not served these interests, then they wouldn't be as supporters as they are. What do I mean by these interests? Yes, there are the geopolitical aspects and elements which are involved. The United States being a world leader, having to face Russia, China, and other elements. But there's also the practical things. And people are very quick to, when they criticize Israel or the relationship, are very quick to point out that the Americans spend billions of dollars a year on Israel, as if the United States doesn't get anything in return. Now, first off, the United States spends a lot of money all over the world for different reasons. But in the case of Israel, most of that money, well, until the war, almost 99% of the funding coming from the United States annually is spent in the United States. Israel has been pretty smart about that, because what Israel did was make sure that understanding that we're to use the financial aid given to us has to be spent in the United States for military purchases. We spread it around to about 48 different states benefit from this money. So the $3 billion a year that Israel received previously from the United States is spent in different regions of the United States in the military industries throughout these countries. So almost every state has an interest in Israel receiving this because it gets back to their own economy. So, but there's also another element. That's the practical one. But there's another element. Anybody involved with big companies, high-tech companies, understand that one of the most important aspects of any company that wants to grow and succeed is what you call R&D, research and development. And companies spend most of their budgets on the research and development aspect. In this case, Israel serves as the practical research and development for the United States. Over the years, anything that we do with the weapons that are given to us, we have to adapt them to the combat. We use them in, sometimes the United States is not in combat to use it. We do. And everything that we learn about the enemy's capabilities, anything we learn about the weapons, we share that with the United States. Now, it also benefits us. And I know this from a general that I've been working with recently, was the head of the engineering corps in Israel. And he has this story about how they would be sitting. He was a brigadier general, Amir Avivi. Some of you may be familiar with him. And Amir says that they were sitting with the top echelon of the American military branch. And they were saying how they discovered in combat they made some kind of development with an engineering weapon. And they said that if we had $800,000 more, we'd be able to develop this. And he said the Americans laughed. And he said, why? He said, give it to us. We'll invest $800 million and we'll improve it. And that's the difference between Israel and the United States. The United States, and if you compare worldwide, the economies, you put all the economies together, the United States is almost double than the entire world together. So the Americans have those abilities that we don't have, but we have the experience and we share that. And every weapon that we've developed over the years, eventually it goes to the United States. If we take what has happened in the battlefield in the past year, say with Iran, for example, we're dependent on Russian technology and Russian weapons, we took them out. We took them out in a way that was unperceived. I don't know all the details. I only know from talking to people that it's still secret and it shocked the Russians, but all of this is being shared with the United States. So now both China and Russia understand that the Americans have abilities to completely take apart their defensive systems. And this is they got from Israel. So this sort of explains that special relationship that's also built on interest, but also on shared values between Israel and the United States. So that's the first part of Israel's international relations. The other area of diplomacy is obviously the United Nations. because that's where the international community comes together. That's where they all sitting and passing international laws. The problem there is that you have, not only against Israel, but against Western interests, you have an automatic majority that is opposed to the West. Of 190 some countries, I believe that only 36 or so are true democracies or relate or connected to the West in any way. And so and that's one of the reasons that when they created the Security Council, that they have the ability I apologize for getting the word in English right now, to veto. That's the word I was looking for, that the major countries have the ability to veto any resolution. Now, a resolution passed in the General Assembly is not binding. So there you constantly have decisions rendered against Israel, regardless of what we do. It's an automatic loss on our part. When it comes to the Security Council, that's where we're very dependent at times on the American ability and the American veto power. So the United Nations is one of the areas where everything is being discussed, but it's very tainted and very one-sided against Israel. So the other option that we have is relationships with individual countries. And that happens through diplomacy. We have not been very successful in the past year. Now, this is something that I know from my work with government, with the Prime Minister's office over the years, that anytime we were engaged, and if we just concentrate on the situation with Gaza, in the 19 and a half years since leaving the Gaza Strip and turning it over to control of the Palestinian Authority, there have been 17 different events that you call them a war, an operation, whatever you want to call it, but there were 17 different instances that erupted. And we knew that we have a sand clock operating from the moment we go to battle, that we have a few days that people will understand us, because usually we're not the ones to initiate it. It's always been initiated on the other side by the terrorist entities, which are the PLO, Hamas, Hezbollah, etc. So it usually erupted as a consequence of an assault on Israel, and every country has the right in international law to defend itself. But when it comes to Israel, and this is the perennial Jew, there are laws, and they're the way the laws are applied to the Jewish people. The only difference now is that, unlike the past 2,000 years, since the establishment of the State of Israel, we're not helpless, and we have the ability to defend ourselves. But even then, there are certain limitations to a large degree that we put upon ourselves for many different reasons that I don't think we even have the time to dwell on at the moment. I can say this not in a favorable way. There was an attitude in Israel for too long that to a large degree emasculated us and made it the belief that we have to cater to international opinion. So we knew that we had a few 4, 5, 6 days maybe, and then the international community will turn or start putting pressure on us to restrain ourselves and stop with the actions being taken against the terrorist entities. Now, a lot of this happens because of internal pressures in these countries. A lot of them have a large minority of people who have, this up until a year and a half ago, was usually people from Muslim and Arab countries. In the past year, it has been also local populations which have been indoctrinated with a poisoning hatred against the State of Israel and a complete delegitimization of the State of Israel. This is to a large degree because of an effort made by the Arabs over the past 40, 50 years even to delegitimize the State of Israel and its right to even exist. We're not talking about the battle that if we are occupying or not, our very existence is not challenged. It is now called into question. And this is that part of diplomacy that goes into public diplomacy. By public diplomacy, it is the effect on the public itself. Now, that can be through, first and foremost, through the media, but it also happens with academia, as we see it happening throughout the United States, Europe, Britain, France, etc. And now, in the past decade, through social media. Now, social media gave Israel a certain advantage because here it's not an organization which is run from the top down and have interest. By the way, international media, and I worked with them for many years. If you take the leaders of this, such as Reuters, AP, and major organizations such as the BBC, when they're first and foremost an economic entity, they have a business, and the media is only another element of that big business. Now, when you take the business into account, they look at the Arab world, which are 1 billion strong. So they have the departments in Arabic, and you have these people not only climbing the ladder, but it affects the whole coverage. I'm giving you a very quick introduction into it. I can go into very much detail, but the fact of the matter is that they're already tainted against Israel for their own reasons. They don't uphold the principles of journalism, of accuracy, etc. Then you have the position of some of these major international media organizations, such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, etc. They have not been favorable to Israel over the years. And you have a dictate coming up from the top down. And if you want your career to be successful, you know what you have to present. So if you have a combination of that, and then you have students coming out of schools of journalism, that many of these schools and many of the universities themselves have a Middle East outreach center that is funded in the past by Saudi Arabia, in the recent 2 decades by Qatar. And Qatar is a country that subsidizes the Hamas because they are very much part of the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood is an extremist Islamic agenda. And what Qatar has succeeded in doing over the past 2 decades is playing this double game. You can say that they're terrorists or they're jihadists in suits. And if you want to see a present example of that, you look at the ISIS-bred organization, terrorist organization that has recently taken over Syria, and you see the head of that organization, Al-Julani, who up until 2 months ago was in the jalabiya, the Arab dress, and with a heavy beard. And this is very much in line with the ISIS model. Since taking over, he's suddenly wearing suits, but please notice he wears a green tie. The green is very significant in the Arab and Islamic culture. He's cut his beard to look more acceptable, and he's speaking more moderately because they've learned the lesson. You speak in a different way to the Western world and deceive them, which is also very much part of the authentic Islamic belief system. So Qatar has been very successful in doing that, spending a lot of their money, they're a very rich country, in universities in the United States, spending billions of dollars and funding these Middle East outreach centers that not only influence the universities, but, and I worked with that when I worked in our consulate in New York 40 years ago, I worked with our academic affairs, and I noticed that even then, that these outreach centers, they also influence the textbooks in high schools in any one of the regions that they exist in. So they're also influencing high school students and the way that their perception of the Middle East. So when you have this going, it was very difficult. And while they're spending billions of dollars, our budget, for example, with working with these universities, and we concentrated only on the top 25 at the time, we had a $200,000 budget, and we had to make do with that. And that was considered one of the biggest budgets in our diplomacy aspect. So the rise of social media over about 10, 12 years ago, it didn't give us an advantage, but sort of leveled the playing field because it gave us the ability for the Israeli public for the first time to reach out. They don't have the restrictions that government has. There are bureaucratic restrictions. There are other restrictions. They're free to do, and it's a bureaucracy when it comes down to it. And I work with government long enough to know governments are dumb. I have enough experience to know that from the inside. And even if you do think differently, it's usually limited. The public don't have those restrictions, and the public can get it out there. So in principle, when you look at the international battle of public opinion, I usually, when I give a speech, I usually draw on either a piece of paper or on a blackboard, and I'll do this 2 X's, which you know to be the game of tic-tac-toe. And I ask 2 people to come up and play the game. And if they're not trying to be too smart for themselves, they do the obvious. You start with the center or one of the corners, Those trying to be smart try to do that and they lose. But basically, anybody, I say that to them, anybody over the age of 4 knows that tic-tac-toe cannot be won. And many of you here are a bit of the generation who probably remember the film from back in the early 80s of war games. Shall we play a game that starts with tic-tac-toe and ends with thermonuclear war? So very much in that sense, the global war of public opinion is a game of tic-tac-toe. When you have their arguments, our arguments, and you can't really win. You have about 15% of the population in the world support Israel. 35%, maybe 40% now support the Arabs. And most people, 50, 60%, really have no idea what's going on. And our goal is to try to affect them, try to influence their thinking, and try to reach them. Now, it's easy to do that in democratic countries. It's much more difficult to do that elsewhere. So in that sense, it's given us certain advantages. Now you even have this element of what is called influencers, individuals who have a very large following on their social media outlets, and they can affect the way people see things and perceive Israel. So that more or less is the framework of the battle of both the diplomatic field that we have been encountering in the past year and the social media public relations battle of diplomacy on the other. So that's the general concept. If you want more, if you have questions and want to dwell into the more specifics, I'm more than happy to.
If anyone has any questions, we can put them in the chat. Or if anyone in the room has any questions.
Say his name again.
Mhm.
What's his name?
So we have a question here. Could you go into what led, your early life, what led you to get into public diplomacy in the first place?
It's all it just happened. I was my mother is Israeli. My dad was an American, converted to Judaism. He was an American GI in Germany. My parents met in Germany. My mother's sisters were married to German Jews who went back to Germany after the war to try to find family. And they had restaurants in Frankfurt that they only served GIs and allies. And my dad was this cute American GI that my mother fell for. And I was an Air Force brat. We traveled around the world for a while. Turkey, Germany, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Florida. And for me, as a young Jewish kid, my mother made it very clear that we're Jewish. We never hid it in any way. So I was used to being the odd man out, or odd kid out. At some point when my dad finished the military service, my mom said, well, why don't we try Israel? So for me, as a kid, I was 10 years old when we immigrated to Israel. It was just another place we came to. And to my shock, that, oh, everybody here is Jewish. That person there is Jewish, and the person there, everybody, even the guy, literally, the guy peeing in the middle of the street, which I was shocked by, was Jewish. Yes, they're all Jewish. How wonderful. So I was 10 years old, and we grew up in the town of Ashkelon, which is just north of the Gaza Strip. This was after the Six-Day War, just before the Yom Kippur War. I don't know why I decided I wanted to preserve my English. I felt it gave me a certain advantage. And so I made sure to keep it. Even when we started studying English in school, a lot of the other American immigrants felt that, oh, they know it, they don't have to attend. And I went from the day we studied ABCs till all my sons and American and British literature. And I never skipped on any of that. I thought it would be embarrassing if I didn't get an A+ in my matriculation, which I'm happy to say I did. And after that, after the school, I volunteered to serve in the paratroopers. And I served in the 890th Regiment of the paratroopers. And the day before I was supposed to finish my service, the Lebanon War, the first Lebanon War broke out. So I got stuck in for another 5 months. When I finished my service there, I hadn't seen my grandparents, I hadn't seen my family in the States for 12 years. It wasn't as easy to travel then as it is these days. And there was no social media. So I was more than happy to go to the States. And I had a cousin who was working at the Israeli consulate in New York. I went to visit my family, and then I went to New York, obviously, and I got a job in the mailroom of the consulate in New York. But because of my English, the head of the Speakers Bureau came to me and said, "Oh, you speak wonderful English. You're a young former paratrooper. You were just in a war. Would you mind go speaking?" And I said, "Well, I've never done it, but..." So I guess I had a natural knack for it. And I went to speak, and it was the day to the year of the war that broke out. And I did it in Long Beach, New York. I still remember that. And it was very successful. And I started speaking on behalf of it was very good because I got an extra income, another $100 a week. So for me, that was a lot of money. I was very happy about that. And then an opportunity came up in the consulate that the consul for academic affairs, as I mentioned before, he was looking for an assistant. And they said, "You don't have to look outside. We have somebody working here as perfect English, perfect Hebrew." And I got a job. So like I said, I just stumbled upon it and I liked it. And I saw that I had the ability to be able to represent Israel in a very positive way, I believe. And it just kept going from there. I came back to Israel. I went to college in the States and then came back to Israel and got a job with the government press office. I worked there for a few years. I left at one point because I was uncomfortable with what I saw was happening under the Oslo Accords. I didn't believe that I believed that we were deceiving ourselves and not demanding that the PLO uphold its side of the agreement. So like a good American, I quit because I can't. Israelis, unfortunately, they stay there and they undermine governments they don't agree with. I quit and I started working with the IDF spokesman. The IDF spokesman was easy because I just had to work for the military and with the foreign media and didn't have to explain the policy. So it was much easier for me. And then I came back when the government was replaced. I came back to the government press office, and 3 years later was appointed as the director of the government press office. And that's how I got that's how I got involved in that field, and believing in the necessity of presenting. I don't like explaining. We use the word hasbara. We're the only country in the world that feels the need to explain itself. I don't believe in the need to explain ourselves or justify ourselves, but to present who and what we're about and to put things in perspective. And even if they don't like it, they're going to have to deal with it. That's my attitude.
Thank you.
Thank you. As another question, since you have longevity in monitoring international opinion vis-a-vis Israel, do you feel that how does today's view compared historically to what has happened in the past? Is this just typical backlash at a time of conflict? Are the tides more negative toward Israel than they were in the past? And where do you see this going in the future?
Wow. I do give this a lot of thought because it is a good question because we're dealing with this. It's very much part of the battlefield. Unfortunately, I believe that Israel itself, if those of you have encountered, and the international media is very quick to publish this, when you have former Israeli leaders or military commanders, I'm not even talking about those who are on the far left wing, but even people like Bogi Ya'alon, who was a former chief of staff and minister of defense, when they had the sheer stupidity of expressing not criticism, but vile, disgusting ways of presenting Israel, saying that, oh, we're committing genocide in Gaza, or our soldiers are violating human rights. This is so despicable. This is so disgusting. When you see this generation, and you say, and I would say this to Jewish crowds in the United States, that there was always questions about Israel's conduct. And I would say to them, listen, you know your children. I'm sure that any one of you know your children, know your grandchildren. You're familiar with them. Then you know our children. The only difference between your children and ours, and I'm talking about Jews right now, is the fact that your ancestors took a boat to the United States and ours took one boat or somewhere else and arrived in Israel. There's no other difference between us. You're there, we're here. And we're very much the same. Our challenges are much more immediate than yours are. Now you have your own set of difficulties right now, but we have questions of life and death here. But I have no qualms about the way our people, this, especially this generation, conducts itself. I know that personally because my son, who's now 22 years old, he served in the paratroopers as well. He followed in my footsteps in the same brigade I was in, and he and his guys fought in the war. He also was supposed to be released the week that the war broke out, so he followed me in other ways as well. And now he's also serving in his reserve duty. And I know my daughter serves with the Givati, not as a combat soldier, but her boyfriend is a combat with Givati. And these kids are wonderful. And we can talk about that separately, about what this whole generation is about. But when you have these leaders, and they could be retired, they could be academics, who are so quick to join in with the criticism and the vile, disgusting way in which Israel is being presented, then it causes a lot of damage. Now, that adds to what already exists there. And this is something that, being a student of history myself and looking at it, Jews have always, in one way or another, been, and this is one of the basics of what is known to be legitimate anti-Semitism, is when Jews are being held to a different standard. We always have been. We're only, Jews today, it's also true for the United States, are much different than the Jewish situation was throughout history, but especially the existence of the state of Israel. And I would always say there, one thing people hate more than a Jew. And what is that? A successful Jew. And Israel is not only the Jewish country, it's a successful Jewish country. And as I said, countries have their own interests. We're a country, a population of 7 million Jews, 10 million people, 7.5 million Jews in this country. Jews about 12, 16 million around the world. We're nothing when it comes to that, as when you compare to the world population. And yet everybody seems to be obsessed with us. And this obsession was problematic, but now they can't just beat us into submission like they could in the past. And they're not going to like it. Now, for too long, we've had this attitude that we have to be nice and we have to be liked and we have to have them understand us. And I say, screw them. People do not respect, or I'll put it different. The only thing people do respect is strength. Nobody is saying a word about the Yazidis who have been massacred and butchered in Iraq over the past decade. Nobody is saying anything about the Christians in Sudan who are being butchered right now by Muslims in Africa, nor the Nigerian Christians. Nobody cares about them. And it happens with other countries around the world. If you don't serve an interest, like, for example, the Ukraine does for Europe and the United States, nobody's going to stand up for you. And we've known this for very long, because with all due respect, nobody fought World War II in order to save the Jews. And when we said never again, and the creation of the state of Israel, never again is now. This is what we meant. You may be able to attack us, you may be able to cause us pain, but you're not going to be able to defeat us anymore. And if there's anything I see coming out of this, yes, we're being criticized and we're being accused of this and that. And listen, right now, I don't think anybody in California really cares about what is happening here, because they have their own problems now. And that's what's going to happen. People eventually deal with their own lives. And I have no problem, for example, with the images coming out of Gaza at the moment. And just so you know, the images of total destruction in Gaza at the moment is not because we decided to be very tough with them and destroy them. No, it's a consequence of their own conduct, not only October 7th, but the fact that they built an infrastructure throughout Gaza. And I know this not only for the reports, my son saw it himself. Every house, every single house, not neighborhood, not hospital, every single living quarters had a room with weapons. And why is this? Because those terrorists who wear civilian clothing, knowing that Israel may come in at some point, know that when they go from one place to another, they know exactly where to find the weapons stash so they can fire at the Israelis. And it's still happening in Gaza at the moment. So it leaves us no choice. And it's not only the underground tunnels It's every building there serves a military purpose. And therefore, under international law, they are legitimate targets. Only international law is applied differently to Israel. But screw them. We have to do, and I can say this as somebody who grew up in Ashkelon, and somebody who I've lived in Jerusalem for many years, but my mother's still there, and I have a 90-year-old mother, and I have my brothers who had their children who suffer from PTSD because of 20 years of missile attacks on Ashkelon. And now my nieces and nephews have their own children, their own 2-year-old babies, who also have PTSD because no country in the world would have tolerated this. And this is what we tolerated for too many years. And October 7th was where we drew the line, because it was very clear. And I have to say this, as we know it today, October 7th was a miracle, and we were very fortunate with October 7th, because the way it happened allowed us to gather ourselves and defeat them, because they were planning. And we know this not only from the things that they said, but from what we uncovered in Lebanon with the Hezbollah. The Hezbollah were 10 times the number of Hamas, and much more trained and much better trained. And had they invaded the same day, you would have also had an uprising coming from Judea and Samaria, the Arabs there, and certainly Israeli Arabs as well. Israel would not have existed today. Because the fortunate thing that happened on October 7th, for whatever reason, they're still looking into what caused them to jump the gun, if you want to call it that. On October 7th, they attacked us at that point and allowed us, after the initial shock, to be able to gather ourselves together and show them what the true might of Israel is. And therefore, all the photos of destruction and misery, I don't care what Americans think about it. I don't care what Europeans think about it. Certainly not what the Chinese or the Russians, because they're 10 times worse, 100 times worse than anything we would do. Every Arab has to see this. Every Arab and Muslim has to understand that when you screw with Israel, there are consequences. When we said never again, this is what we meant. And you have miserable lives now. And by the way, it's resonating around the Arab world. You may not see this, but what we're seeing here in Arab media, in Arab newspapers and television shows, is religious leaders, political leaders, journalists, all saying, we've lost, we've been stupid for 75 years. Why did we find it necessary to fight Israel? The Iranians drew us into this. The Hezbollah drew us into that. They understand the stupidity on their part. And this is what we have to deal with. And this is the important thing for Israel, because we have to live with them. We don't have to live with the Europeans. We don't have to even live with the Americans. We have to live with these people here. And if we can, from a point of strength, come to them and say, look, you've wasted your time with the war against us. Why continue with this misery? Let's get together. You have the Abrahamic Accords. This may be the future. Once that happens, I believe that all the elements and the ricochets coming from what is happening now will die down a bit. People will move on to other things. But until then, and this is something that was never expected, they didn't expect us to last this long in the battlefield. They didn't expect that we would be able to be united and fight this off. And more than that, not only be successful in the battlefield, Israel's economy, the indications coming out of the economic situation of Israel in the past year is that we're still one of the more successful and strongest economies around the world. So they didn't even cause a dent. They hurt us tremendously. They woke us up to a large degree. But in the end of the day, they paying the consequences of it. That's what matters. And everything else, we'll worry about that later. It's certainly, if the Europeans don't like us, or they kick us out of the International World Soccer Tournament, or the Prime Minister of Canada has what to say, or the Prime Minister of France, the lives of our children are 10 times, 100 times, 1,000,000 times more important than anything that a freaking German or British or Frenchman has to say about Israel. Sorry for being a bit rude.
Daniel, thank you so much for that answer. That was so thoughtful. Another question we have is, can you recommend any books or other materials to enhance our understanding about Israeli diplomacy in its current state? And to piggyback onto that, do you have any tips for our viewers of how they can talk about it to people who have been exposed to negativity in their lives about Israel?
I'll start with that first. I have found over the years that trying to explain yourself or trying to convince doesn't really work. Like I said, you have that element, just like any of you here are a strong support of Israel. If you have somebody from the other side trying to convince you, you're not going to be convinced. So we're not going to convince them. We try to influence others. And for a long time, what happens is that if you try to show that you're closer to them and you're trying to find the middle ground, and they're very extreme and they never move. If you've noticed, just like the negotiations with Hamas, Hamas has not moved with respect to the Israeli hostages. They have not moved an inch despite everything they've gone through. And the same thing happens with their public diplomacy. They don't move at all. They've even gone further to the extreme. They deny even the right. They're deceptive about what is happening here. I wrote recently, we celebrated the Christmas holiday. And I remember that because I went to public schools in the United States, and I would, on the public school bus, and I'm talking about the Deep South back in the 60s, I was like the only Jewish kid there, and I knew all these songs by heart. I loved the Christmas carols. They were very cool. And one of the ones I loved was Noel, the angels did sing, and they talk about the King of Israel. And this is a song from the Middle Ages. They were talking about the King of Israel then, and now they're all telling us, oh, Jesus was a Palestinian. So even this complete idiocy of what is happening. So you can't really debate or discuss with them. One of the things I found gets the attention of those who don't really know what's going on is if you're very brutal and rude to the other side. I curse them out. I lost my Instagram. I had a very successful Instagram page, and on October 7th, I just started cursing them all out, and they closed down my page. So I don't recommend that. But you have to identify those who are not really understanding and waste your time on them. And make them question what they think they know. Don't try to argue. Don't try to be, just raise the questions. First of all, what would you do if you were in Israel's situation? What would you do if this or that was happening? They start talking about, yeah, but Israel's occupying. Yes, there's a debate going on there about that. But do you deny Israel's right to exist? If somebody says to you, they question Israel's right to exist, don't waste your time on them. Don't waste your time, because it's obvious that they're not somebody that's going to be even interested. But you have to show Israeli, if you show, and this is one of the things that I mentioned before, that the moment the Israeli public were involved, then people saw the real Israel. And it sort of shocks them when they say Israel's an apartheid state. Oh, yes, so show them one of the members of the Supreme Court who's a Muslim, or members of Knesset who are elected officials, who are connected to the PLO and to Yasser Arafat, who are elected in Israeli elections, to the people who work throughout it, walking down the street in Israel. You know, I live here in Jerusalem, and I'm walking on if those of you are familiar with the promenade overlooking the old city. And there was a wedding going on there a few months ago. And it was a Hasidic wedding. And the Arabs who were there, because the Arab neighborhood is nearby, they were all coming in and cheering and clapping hands. So this is the only country in the Middle East where Jews, Muslims, and Christians can live side by side, don't have to love each other, don't really have to get along, but at least they're not combating each other. There are elements who are. But when you go through Jerusalem on the day-to-day, and you don't believe that Israel has some kind of obligation to treat them differently, this is this whole woke attitude of, oh, there are those who are perennial victims. Nobody's a victim. Israel doesn't owe anything to anybody. Just look at the facts. Israel is running this country, and the only alternative and the only place in the Middle East where Jews, Christians, and Muslims can worship freely, live freely, and you hear the mosques, and you hear on Friday Shabbat coming in, and you hear the mosque you hear it all around you. That's Israel. And if anybody believes, and it's the only country, for example, that Christians have grown in numbers throughout the Middle East. It's the only country in the Middle East that the numbers of Christians have grown and are not being reduced. So that speaks for itself. And if you can understand that, then you can start judging Israel and trying to understand where Israel comes from. As for books, I haven't really read a lot. Oh, there's, what's his name? The American lawyer. He wrote a very good book on public diplomacy. Dershowitz. Dershowitz has an excellent book. I highly recommend that. I recently, last year, wrote a book about my experiences with the foreign media, but it's out of Cambridge in England and it's too expensive, so I don't tell anybody to buy it. I just like the fact that I can say I'm a published author now and brag about that. It could have been empty. I had a long argument with them because they didn't believe a lot of the stuff that I told them about my experiences with the media. And though it's all documented and all that, they were afraid they were going to get sued. I said, listen, just took 8 years to get it published. Just put it out there. I don't even care. I wanted to call the book. The book is called Israel and the Foreign Media. I wanted the book to be called The Cradle of Fake News, because this whole aspect of fake news that we're encountering now in Western society, it started with the violations of journalistic principles by the foreign media as their coverage of the Middle East. So I think Alan Dershowitz is the best one to look into. Trying to think of anybody else. Don't really read a lot of books, so don't. Today I would recommend more podcasts and listening into content that you can get. I think the best one's doing it now, and I admit I'm in touch with them and trying to help them out. The Jewish News Syndicate, who are really now elevating and doing more news coming out of Israel to give you insights. One thing I do recommend: do not read Haaretz newspaper. Do not read them under any circumstances. And unfortunately, every one of the things, and we know this from a poll we conducted with the foreign press here, that every one of the those who responded to the poll, about half of the journalists, and we used to have up until a year ago, but for the decade up until a year ago, it was reduced. But up until a decade ago, we had the largest foreign press contingent in the world here in Israel. And out of the foreigners, we asked them, what are your influences? 100%, every single one of them read Haaretz newspaper. So you're getting, not only if you read Haaretz in English, you're getting from all the other foreign media, you're getting a version of Haaretz. And Haaretz is horrible for the state of Israel. So there's not really a lot of English content coming out of Israel by Israelis. There was I-24, but they're reducing their English, and I'm happy about that because they weren't very good either. But JNS seems to be the ones who are doing a good job of getting the real feelings of the Israeli public out right now.
So we have another question about the Abraham Accords and the future possibilities of treaties between Saudi Arabia and the other countries involved. How does it benefit them? How does it benefit Israel? What is the likelihood of that succeeding in bringing more collaboration and stability to the Middle East?
Well, I think everything starts right now with the American administration. And I don't mean to get into American politics, but it's obvious that even if you did have support from this administration, to a large degree, not that they were anti-Israel, but their way of running and their whole perception of how to engage in international relations and in diplomacy is flawed. And unfortunately, we suffered the consequences not from the administration, but from our own flaws ourselves. And I mentioned before that if you want to talk about this generation, I say this very clearly, that our generation failed our children. And it doesn't matter if we were right wing or left wing. The fact that we got caught up in this fake belief, it wasn't wrong to try to achieve peace with the Arab countries. But we made two mistakes: believing that they perceive the world the way we do, not understanding Islam and how, especially when you're talking about terrorist entities whose sheer existence is the annihilation of Israel. We're not talking about Egypt or Jordan or even Syria and Lebanon, who exist as countries. We're talking about the whole existence of the Palestinian resistance, as they call it, is resistance against the existence of Israel. Now they're very open about it. From the river to the sea, what does that mean? Annihilation of Israel. Arafat didn't change that. He said, well, right now we'll get what we can and then we'll continue. He didn't say, this is it, this is the end of it. But we lied to ourselves. That was the one part. The other part was the withdrawal from the Gaza Strip and leaving the Gaza Strip without making sure. And here there were promises said that if they fire one missile at us, we'll know how to deal with them because now we have the international community supporting us. By the way, we were supported for 1 month. 1 month after the disengagement. And then when Israel responded to the mortar fire against us, this was mortar, not missile at the time, we were criticized 1 month after the disengagement because nobody held them to the arrangements. There was no agreement with them, but at least arrangements that it's unacceptable to fire at an independent country. So the fact that we didn't engage in that and instead engage in internal arguments, we failed. And this is what brought upon us the catastrophe of October 7th. What we did right probably was we brought up these kids wonderfully. We did a good job with bringing them up. Their dedication to the state of Israel, their commitment, their understanding what we're here for. And this I give credit to individual families because the system itself tries to work to the detriment of the Jewish identity of the state of Israel, unfortunately. But that's a whole different topic that we can discuss separately. On this particular issue, I'm saying that here, the American administration was very much, at least the Democratic administration, have their perception of how international relations have to be dealt with. And it goes back to the Obama period of trying to appease the most extreme element, believing that if you engage with the extreme element, they'll listen to you. And it's failed miserably. This new administration, which may not be perfect in itself, but in respect to Israel, we have one good thing here. And it's not that they're supportive of Israel. They back Israel up. And what I'm trying, and I try to say here to Israelis to say, oh, great, we have Trump coming in now. Everything's going to be hunky-dory. No, it's not. Because again, it's interests. The American president, at the end of the day, will do what is in the best interest of the United States. The advantage we have here is that if we come to them and we say to this administration, look, we want A, B, C, or D, they'll support us with that, even if it contradicts American interests, because they know a strong Israel does serve an American interest. But we have to get our act together before that. We have to determine what we want. So what will happen the day after? Yes, we need to expand the relationship with the Arab countries. One thing that I can tell you now is not going to happen. 90% of Israelis will have nothing to do with this. The Palestinian Authority will not be in charge of the Gaza Strip. Any government trying to promote that will be toppled. I don't care if it's Netanyahu or Netanyahu's mother or his father. The public in Israel who are strongly behind Netanyahu will not support a policy of allowing any Palestinian element to retake the Gaza Strip, because our children will not be under missile fire again. We're not going to go back to that situation. The same goes for Lebanon. Seems to be positive developments happening there. But these positive developments because today an American-supported military leader was elected prime minister, and the situation in Lebanon, because of Israel, has made it easier for those elements who are not jihadists, such as Hezbollah, to eliminate the influence of Hezbollah. And Syria now has been taken out of the picture. And Iran now, because of Syria, also cannot influence Lebanon to the degree it did internally up until now. So you may have, because all we don't need a peace treaty with Lebanon. We just need them to keep elements like the Hezbollah away from our border. And if they do fire in our direction, that they handle it and not leave it to us. And the other thing is that we have to understand, and we're doing it so far with this treaty with Lebanon at the moment, any violation being conducted by Hezbollah, and anytime you hear that Israel's violated this or that, understand we're not doing it because we're violating and we're looking. No, they're trying to restore themselves in South Lebanon, and it's not going to happen. And we have to continue pursuing this in relations to Gaza and with Lebanon, and if need, in Syria as well. And we have huge advantages now, and also an understanding that we built up in our minds how strong the enemy was over the past 2 decades, and therefore refrained ourselves. Now we know that they don't even compare to our abilities, and we have the strength to take care of business when we need to do that. So that happening, and the Arabs understanding that that is the attitude in Israel, together with the support of the United States, you could see an arrangement with Saudi Arabia, the Arab Emirates. What we have to strongly fight against is the acceptance of Qatar as a legitimate entity around the world. They have to not only disassociate themselves, they have to stop being the fundings of the Islamic Jihad, which they are, and the Muslim Brotherhood. Because the Muslim Brotherhood, Israel is not their goal. Their goal is world domination. Don't believe me, read their content. They said themselves they're very open about what they believe needs to be done. And so that has to be, and that's the United States' responsibility, because they're the world power. I believe that there will be an attack to eliminate the potential of nuclear capabilities of Iran, and hopefully through that to push the toppling of the Iranian regime and having other elements, just like in Syria, taking over in Iran, opening the door to stronger American influence in Iran as well. Being at this administration, they probably will be better at doing this, not by having an American presence there, but making it financially beneficial to these countries to align with the United States and not engage in a global jihad, etc. So you may have that happening. It's what could happen in Gaza. This was part of the Abrahamic Accords. You have the building of an infrastructure, and it's built, by the way, from the Emirates through Saudi Arabia, through Jordan, to the border with Israel, of trains. And they were just looking to connect it to a port. And today they know that it's perhaps not a good idea to have a port in any one of the Israelis, Haifa or Ashdod, because they could be attacked. But if you have a port in Gaza run by either the Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia, this could potentially be the resolution to the situation in Gaza. It becomes an economic entity, similarly to Hong Kong, for example, where it's basically the route from the Far East, India, etc., to Europe, not only for energy, but also for goods, etc. And that could be the direction that they go in. But first we have to finish off Hamas. We have to make sure that Lebanon restores its governmental integrity and controls these extreme elements. Syria is a question, and a greater concern right now is the attempt on the part of Turkey to move in and restore, as they're saying right now, the Ottoman Empire, which could be detrimental to Israel.
Daniel, thank you so much for that. And thank you so much for coming and speaking with us and sharing your expertise.
It's my pleasure. Thank you all.